Have you ever made a decision and later wondered, why did I do that? You knew the facts, you understood the risks, and yet, in the moment, fear took over. Tonight, we're diving deep into the silent battle inside your brain. Fear versus logic, and why even smart people act irrationally. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you may never trust your instincts the same way again. Take a moment and think about the last decision you regret. Maybe it was something small, sending a message too quickly. Maybe it was something bigger, walking away from an opportunity. Or reacting emotionally in a moment you later wished you could rewind. In hindsight, the answer often feels obvious. So, why didn't logic win in the moment? For centuries, humans have proudly believed one thing about themselves, that we are rational creatures, thinkers guided by reason, evidence, and careful judgment. But modern psychology and neuroscience tell a very different story. Again and again, research shows that our decisions are not driven by logic first. They are driven by emotion, especially fear, and only afterward does logic step in to explain what we've already done. In other words, the feeling often comes before the thinking. Inside your brain, there is a constant, silent tug-of-war happening every single day. On one side is your survival system, fast, automatic, and emotional. This system evolved to keep you alive in dangerous environments. On the other side is your thinking system, slower, more analytical, and capable of careful reasoning. Most of us like to believe the second system is in charge. But in high-pressure moments, the first system often moves faster. Psychologists describe this using what is known as dual process theory, the idea that the human mind operates through two different modes of thinking. One is fast, intuitive, and emotional. The other is slow, deliberate, and logical. And here is the uncomfortable truth. The fast system usually speaks first. You can see this pattern everywhere in modern life. Think about the stock market. During periods of uncertainty, even experienced investors sometimes panic and sell at the worst possible moment, not because the data suddenly changed, but because fear became louder than patience, or consider emergencies. Many people assume they will act calmly under pressure, but real-world footage often shows something different. People freezing, hesitating, or making split-second choices that don't match what they later say they should have done. Even in everyday arguments, the same pattern appears. A simple disagreement escalates. Voices rise. Words come out that don't reflect our best thinking, and later, when emotions cool down, many people quietly ask themselves, why did I react like that? The answer lies deep in the architecture of the human brain. Because your brain was never designed to be perfectly logical. It was designed, first and foremost, to keep you alive. For most of human history, reacting quickly to potential danger meant the difference between survival and extinction. Hesitating too long to analyze a threat could be fatal. So evolution built a brain that prioritizes speed over perfect accuracy, emotion over pure reason, and safety over calm reflection. In the modern world, however, that ancient survival wiring sometimes creates a mismatch. We now face deadlines instead of predators, social pressure instead of physical danger, financial uncertainty instead of immediate life or death threats. But the brain's alarm system still reacts as if the stakes are primal. And that is where irrational behavior often begins. As we move forward, we're going to step inside the brain itself, to understand what happens in the milliseconds when fear and logic collide. Because once you see this hidden battle clearly, you start to notice it everywhere, and more importantly, you begin to understand your own decisions in a completely new way. To understand why fear so often beats logic, we need to travel deep into the human brain, to a small, almond-shaped structure that has been quietly protecting our species for tens of thousands of years. It's called the amygdala, Despite its small size, the amygdala is one of the most powerful survival tools your brain possesses. You have two of them, one in each hemisphere, buried deep within the limbic system, the emotional core of the brain. Think of the amygdala as your brain's early warning radar. Its primary job is simple but critical: detect potential threats and prepare your body to respond fast. Not perfectly, not logically, but quickly enough to survive. What the amygdala actually does every second of the day. Your senses are sending massive amounts of information into your brain. Sights, sounds, movements, facial expressions, tones of voice. Most of this information is harmless, but your amygdala is constantly scanning one specific question: could this be dangerous? And here's the key detail most people don't realize. The amygdala does not wait for full proof. It works on probability and speed, not certainty. If something even slightly resembles a past threat, the amygdala can trigger a fear response before your conscious mind has time to evaluate what's really happening. From an evolutionary standpoint, this design was brilliant, because in the wild, being wrong in the safe direction, overreacting, was far less costly than being wrong in the dangerous direction. Your brain would rather trigger a false alarm than miss a real threat. The speed advantage. Amygdala versus thinking brain. One of the most important reasons fear feels automatic is simple. The amygdala is faster than your logical brain. Much faster. When sensory information enters your brain, it can take two different routes, what neuroscientists often call the low road and the high road. These two pathways are the heart of the fear versus logic battle. The low road. Fast and rough. The low road is the brain's emergency shortcut. Here's how it works. Sensory input gives thalamus, gives amygdala, gives body reaction. This pathway is extremely fast, sometimes within tens of milliseconds. But speed comes at a cost. The low road processes information in a rough, incomplete way. It doesn't analyze carefully. It doesn't verify details. It simply asks, does this look like danger? If the answer is even maybe, the alarm can fire. The high road. Slow and precise. The high road takes a more thoughtful route. Sensory input gives thalamus, gives cortex, gives amygdala. This pathway involves the thinking brain, especially the prefrontal cortex. It evaluates context. It checks details. It asks more sophisticated questions like, what exactly am I seeing? Is this actually a threat? What is the appropriate response? But there's a trade-off. The high road is slower. By the time it finished its analysis, the low road may have already triggered your body. And that is why fear often feels like it comes out of nowhere. Story example. The rope that looked like a snake. Imagine you walking along a quiet trail at dusk. The light is fading. Your mind is relaxed. Suddenly, you see something long and curved on the ground in front of you. Before you even consciously think the word snake, your body jumps back. Your heart rate spikes. Your muscles tense. Your breathing changes. Only a second later, do you look again and realize it's just a rope. In that moment, your brain didn't fail. It performed exactly as evolution designed it. The low road saw a snake-shaped pattern and triggered the amygdala instantly. Your thinking brain, using the high road, arrived a moment later and corrected the mistake, but the reaction had already happened. This tiny delay between emotional reaction and logical evaluation is where many irrational behaviors begin. Why fear responses feel so automatic when the amygdala detects potential danger. It doesn't just create a feeling, it activates a full-body survival program. Within fractions of a second, it signals the hypothalamus, which activates the autonomic nervous system, which releases stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol. Your body shifts into one of three classic survival modes: fight, confront the threat; flight, escape the danger; freeze, become momentarily still to assess or avoid detection. This entire cascade can begin before you are consciously aware of what triggered it. That's why fear reactions often feel instant, overwhelming, and sometimes embarrassing in hindsight, because by the time your logical brain catches up, your body is already in motion. The millisecond that shapes behavior. Researchers have found that the amygdala can begin responding to threatening stimuli in as little as 20 to 30 milliseconds. For perspective, that is faster than conscious awareness. It means your emotional brain can begin preparing your body for action before your thinking brain has fully understood what you were looking at. This speed once saved human lives on ancient savannas. But in the modern world, filled with social stress, financial pressure, and psychological threats, the same rapid system can sometimes push us toward decisions that don't fully match reality. And this is where the deeper conflict begins. Because the amygdala is not trying to make you look smart, or calm, or perfectly rational. It has one priority above all else: keep you alive. Even if that means overreacting sometimes. As we move into the next chapter, we lines meet the other side of this internal battle, the part of your brain that tries to slow things down, weigh evidence, and apply logic. The question is not whether you have this system. You do. The real question is, why does it sometimes lose control when you need it most? If the amygdala is the brain's alarm system, then the prefrontal cortex is its chief strategist. This region, located just behind your forehead, is what allows humans to do something remarkable: pause, analyze, and choose a response instead of simply reacting. It is the part of the brain most responsible for what we call rational behavior. Every time you weigh pros and cons, plan for the future, control an impulse, or stop yourself from saying something you might regret, you are using your prefrontal cortex. What the prefrontal cortex actually does: the prefrontal cortex is involved in some of the most advanced mental abilities humans possess. It helps you think logically, evaluate consequences, control emotional impulses, focus attention, make long-term plans, override automatic reactions in many ways. This region is what allows humans to function in complex modern societies. It's the reason you can wait instead of grabbing, calculate instead of guessing, reflect instead of reacting. But here is the critical detail: the prefrontal cortex is powerful, but it is not built for speed. Slow but accurate. Unlike the amygdala's rapid-fire responses, the prefrontal cortex works more carefully. It gathers information. It compares possibilities. It simulates outcomes. This process takes time, sometimes just fractions of a second. But in survival terms, that delay can matter. Think of it like this: the amygdala is a smoke alarm. The prefrontal cortex is a careful investigator. The alarm is designed to ring immediately, even if it's just burnt toast. The investigator, on the other hand, wants to examine the room, check the source, and confirm whether there is real danger. In calm situations, this partnership works beautifully. But under pressure, the balance can shift. When stress enters the system, here is where the story becomes especially important. The prefrontal cortex is highly sensitive to stress. When your brain detects threat and the amygdala activates the body's stress response, powerful chemicals begin to flood your system, including adrenaline and cortisol. In small amounts, these chemicals can sharpen focus. But when fear becomes intense or prolonged, something unexpected happens. The brain begins to prioritize survival mode over careful reasoning. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes sense. If your ancestors were facing a predator, the brain didn't want them calmly analyzing options for too long. It wanted fast, decisive action. So under high stress, neural resources shift. Activity in the amygdala increases, while activity in the prefrontal cortex can decrease. In simple terms, the thinking brain becomes partially suppressed, not permanently, not completely, but enough to change behavior in very real ways. The temporary shutdown effect. Neuroscientists sometimes describe this as a kind of functional hijacking. When fear is strong, the prefrontal cortex has a harder time performing its usual roles, such as holding information in working memory, regulating emotional reactions, making balanced decisions, inhibiting impulsive behavior. This is why people often say things like, "I wasn't thinking. I just reacted. My mind went blank." In many cases, that experience reflects a real, measurable shift in brain activity. The logical system didn't disappear, but it was temporarily pushed into the background. Real-life example. Test anxiety. One of the clearest everyday examples of this effect happens in classrooms and exam halls around the world. Imagine a student who has studied carefully for weeks. They understand the material. They have answered practice questions correctly. Their logical knowledge is solid, but on the day of the exam, something changes. As the test begins, anxiety rises, their heart starts beating faster, their breathing becomes shallow, their palms may become sweaty, and suddenly, something frustrating happens. Questions they know the answers to feel strangely difficult to recall. Their mind feels foggy. Simple facts seem just out of reach. After the exam ends and the stress fades, many students experience an almost painful realization. I knew that. Why couldn't I remember it? What happened in that moment was not a lack of intelligence. It was a stress response. Elevated anxiety can impair working memory and prefrontal cortex efficiency, the very systems needed for recall and reasoning. In other words, fear didn't erase the knowledge, it interfered with access to it. Why this matters in everyday life. This same brain dynamic doesn't just affect students, it appears in high-pressure job interviews, emotional conversations, emergency decisions, financial panic moments, public speaking situations. Anytime fear rises sharply, the balance between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex can shift. And when that happens, even intelligent, capable people can behave in ways that later surprise them, not because they lack logic, but because the brain's survival wiring temporarily took priority. The core insight: understanding this changes how we interpret human behavior. Irrational reactions are not always signs of weakness or poor judgment. Often, they are the result of a brain system that evolved for survival in a very different world. Because the truth is, your prefrontal cortex is incredibly powerful. But under fear, it doesn't always get the final say. In the next chapter, we explore something even more fascinating: why evolution intentionally designed the brain this way, and why, in many situations, fear is actually supposed to win. By now, we've seen the two main players inside the human brain. The amygdala, fast, emotional, always scanning for danger. The prefrontal cortex, slower, thoughtful, capable of logic. So the natural question is, if logic is more accurate, why didn't evolution design us to rely on it first? The answer lies deep in our evolutionary past. Because for most of human history, the world was not safe, predictable, or forgiving. It was uncertain, dangerous, and often unforgiving to hesitation. And in that environment, the cost of being wrong was not equal. Imagine a human ancestor walking through tall grass thousands of years ago. They hear a sudden rustling sound nearby. At that moment, their brain has two options. Option 1. Assume it as nothing dangerous and keep walking calmly. Option 2. Assume it might be a predator and react immediately. Now consider the outcomes. If they overreacted when there was no real threat, the cost was small. Maybe a moment of wasted energy. Maybe a brief spike of fear. But if they underreacted when a predator was actually present, the cost could be fatal. Over thousands of generations, this imbalance shaped the human nervous system. Evolution strongly favored brains that erred on the side of caution. Not perfect accuracy, not calm neutrality, but survival-first responsiveness. In modern psychology and evolutionary biology, this is often explained through a simple but powerful concept: false positives were safer than false negatives. Let's break that down. A false positive is when your brain detects danger that isn't really there, like jumping at a shadow or flinching at a loud but harmless noise. A false negative, on the other hand, is when your brain misses a real threat. From an evolutionary perspective, false positives were usually harmless. False negatives could end your genetic line. So natural selection gradually tuned the human fear system to be hypersensitive rather than perfectly calibrated. Your brain is not optimized to be right every time. It is optimized to avoid catastrophic mistakes. This is why the amygdala is designed to react quickly and sometimes aggressively. So evolution built a system that often asks, better safe than sorry, and most of the time, it answers yes. This is also why fear responses can feel disproportionate to the actual situation. The system was never designed for modern comfort, it was designed for ancient survival. Here's where things get especially interesting. The human brain evolved in environments that look nothing like the world we live in today. For most of our species' history, threats were N physical, N immediate EN and often life-threatening, and predators, hostile environments, interpersonal violence. But today, many of our most common stressors are very different: deadlines, social pressure, financial uncertainty, public embarrassment, digital overload. These are psychologically intense, but rarely physically dangerous. And yet, the ancient fear circuitry in the brain still reacts as if survival might be on the line. This creates what scientists sometimes call an evolutionary mismatch. Your brain is running survival software in a world that has changed faster than biology can keep up. You've probably experienced this yourself. You're alone at home, the environment is quiet. Suddenly, a loud noise comes from another room. Before you even think, your body reacts. Your shoulders tense, your heart rate jumps. Your attention locks onto the sound. Only a moment later do you realize it was just something falling, or the house settling, or a harmless background noise. In that moment, your brain was not being irrational in the evolutionary sense. It was being efficiently cautious. Because the system is built on one deeply practical rule: your brain would rather embarrass you than bury you. That single principle explains a huge amount of human behavior. Why we sometimes overreact, why we sometimes panic too quickly, why logic sometimes arrives a moment too late. What makes the human brain remarkable is also what makes it vulnerable. We possess extraordinary reasoning abilities, but layered on top of those abilities is a much older survival system that still gets first priority in moments of uncertainty. And most of the time, we don't even notice the handoff happening. Fear speaks first, logic speaks second, and understanding that sequence is the first step toward regaining balance. In the next chapter, we line zoom into the exact moment when fear begins to hijack clear thinking, and what happens inside your body in those critical seconds. Because once you see the biological chain reaction, irrational behavior starts to make a lot more sense. Up to this point, we've talked about the brain's design. But what does it actually look like in real time when fear begins to overpower logic? Because in many situations, the shift is not gradual, it happens fast, often within seconds. And once the process starts, it can temporarily reshape how you see, think, and decide. To understand this critical moment, we need to follow the biological chain reaction that unfolds the instant your brain detects threat. Step 1. The alarm fires. The moment the amygdala flags something as potentially dangerous, it sends an urgent signal to another key structure, the hypothalamus. From there, your body's stress response system activates. Within moments, powerful hormones begin flooding your bloodstream, especially adrenaline, cortisol. These chemicals are not mistakes. They are survival tools. Adrenaline prepares your body for immediate action. Your heart beats faster. Your breathing quickens. Your muscles tighten. Your reaction time improves. Cortisol, meanwhile, mobilizes energy reserves and keeps the body on high alert. In genuine danger, this response can save lives. But in modern psychological stress, the same surge can produce unintended side effects. Step 2. Attention narrows. One of the first cognitive changes under acute stress is something called tunnel vision. From a survival standpoint, this makes sense. If a threat appears, your brain wants you focused directly on it, not distracted by irrelevant details. So attention becomes sharply narrowed. Peripheral awareness decreases, flexible thinking drops. The brain prioritizes speed over breadth. In life or death situations, this can be helpful. But in complex modern environments, tunnel vision can cause people to miss important information right in front of them. It's one of the earliest signs that logic is beginning to lose ground. Step 3. Emotional flooding. As stress hormones continue rising, emotional intensity increases. The body feels charged, the mind feels urgent, and the window for calm reflection begins to shrink. Psychologists sometimes describe this state as emotional flooding, when the nervous system becomes so activated that rational processing struggles to keep up. During emotional flooding, patience decreases, impulse control weakens, reactions become faster and more automatic, nuanced thinking becomes harder. Importantly, the person often feels justified in the moment, because the brain is prioritizing immediate response, not careful evaluation. Step 4. Working memory drops. Here is where the prefrontal cortex begins to feel the strain most clearly. Working memory, the system that allows you to hold and manipulate information in real time, becomes less efficient under high stress. And this has major consequences. When working memory is impaired, people may struggle to recall important facts, weigh multiple options, follow complex reasoning, regulate emotional reactions. This is one of the key ways stress interferes with executive function, the brain's higher-level control system. Research in cognitive neuroscience consistently shows that acute stress can reduce prefrontal cortex performance while amplifying amygdala-driven responses. In simple terms, the survival brain gets louder, while the thinking brain gets quieter. Real-life case, road rage. You can see this process unfold clearly in episodes of road rage. A driver is moving through traffic normally, then suddenly, another car cuts them off. In that split second, the amygdala flags a threat, adrenaline surges, attention narrows. Before the driver has fully evaluated the situation, emotional flooding begins. Their body feels tense, their thoughts become more rigid. Their reaction time speeds up, but their judgment may worsen. Under calmer conditions, the same person might shrug off the incident. But under stress, the brain's balance has shifted. What follows, aggressive honking, yelling, risky driving, often reflects a moment where emotional circuitry temporarily overpowered executive control. Later, many people look back and think, that wasn't like me. But neurologically, the shift was very real. Real-life case, panic buying. Another powerful example appeared repeatedly during periods of uncertainty around the world. Panic buying. When people perceive scarcity or threat to essential resources, the amygdala's alarm system can activate rapidly. Even individuals who normally make calm financial decisions may suddenly feel an urgent need to act immediately. Under stress, future planning weakens. Emotional urgency rises, group behavior amplifies fear, logical supply analysis gets ignored. The result is often behavior that looks irrational from the outside, but makes more sense when viewed through the lens of stress biology. Again, the brain is prioritizing safety and certainty, not perfect reasoning. Real-life case, emergency overreactions. In high-pressure emergencies, the same pattern can appear. Some people respond effectively, but others may freeze unexpectedly, forget trained procedures, make rush decisions, miss obvious solutions. This is not always a lack of knowledge. Often, it reflects the temporary overload of the stress response system. When arousal becomes too high, performance can actually decline, a phenomenon well documented in performance psychology. What the research shows, across many studies in neuroscience and behavioral psychology, one pattern appears consistently. Acute stress impairs aspects of executive function, including cognitive flexibility, working memory, inhibitory control, complex decision-making. At the same time, stress strengthens rapid, habitual, and emotionally driven responses. From an evolutionary perspective, this trade-off made sense. But in modern environments that require calm reasoning under pressure, it can sometimes lead to decisions we later question. The critical insight. In the moment when fear surges, most people are not choosing irrationality on purpose. Their brain is shifting priorities. Speed over accuracy, urgency over reflection, survival readiness over careful reasoning. And because this shift happens so quickly, many people don't even realize it's occurring. In the next chapter, we lines explore another hidden layer of human irrationality, the mental shortcuts and cognitive biases that quietly shape decisions even when we believe we're rethinking clearly. Because sometimes, fear doesn't need to shout. It just needs to subtly tilt the scales. So far, we've explored moments when fear surges suddenly, when stress hormones rise and logic gets pushed aside. But here's something even more subtle. Sometimes, we act irrationally even when we feel calm. No panic, no racing heart, no obvious stress response. And yet, the mind still bends reality. Why? Because the human brain doesn't just react emotionally. It also relies on mental shortcuts that can quietly distort judgment. Psychologists call these shortcuts cognitive biases. They are not signs of low intelligence. In fact, they exist because the brain is trying to be efficient. The world is complex. Information is overwhelming. Decisions often need to be made quickly, so the brain developed fast rules of thumb to simplify thinking. Most of the time, these shortcuts help, but sometimes they mislead us in very predictable ways. Let us look at 4 of the most powerful biases that shape human behavior, often without us noticing. Bias number 1. The availability heuristic. The availability heuristic is the brain's tendency to judge how likely something is based on how easily examples come to mind. In simple terms, if you can quickly remember something, your brain assumes it must be common, but memory is not a perfect reflection of reality. It is heavily influenced by emotion, media exposure, and vivid storytelling. Everyday example: fear of flying. Many people feel intense fear about airplane crashes. The images are dramatic, news coverage is extensive. The stories are emotionally powerful. Because of this, plane crashes are highly available in memory. But statistically, commercial air travel is far safer than driving. Yet many people feel calm getting into a car and anxious boarding a plane, not because the risk is higher, but because the memory of plane disasters is more vivid. The brain is using emotional availability as a shortcut for probability, and sometimes it gets the math wrong. Bias number 2. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is one of the most powerful forces in human decision-making. It refers to a simple psychological reality: losses hurt more than equivalent gains feel good. In many studies, researchers have found that the emotional pain of losing something is roughly twice as strong as the pleasure of gaining the same thing. From an evolutionary perspective, this made sense. Losing resources in the wild could threaten survival, so the brain became highly sensitive to potential loss. But in modern life, this bias can lead to overly cautious or emotionally driven decisions. Everyday example: holding losing investments. Imagine someone buys a stock that begins to fall. Logically, if the fundamentals are weak, selling may be the smart move. But many investors hold on far longer than they should. Why? Because selling would lock in the loss, and psychologically, that feels very painful. So, instead, the brain often chooses hope over logic. Not because the person lacks intelligence, but because loss aversion is quietly influencing the decision. Bias number 3. Negativity bias. The human brain pays more attention to negative information than positive information. This is called the negativity bias. Bad news sticks longer. Criticism hits harder. Threatening information captures attention faster. Again, this traces back to survival. In dangerous environments, ignoring negative signals could be deadly. So, the brain evolved to give potential threats extra weight. But in modern life, this bias can distort perception. Everyday example: one negative comment. Imagine a creator receives 100 positive comments and one harsh criticism. Logically, the positive feedback should dominate. But emotionally, many people find their attention pulled toward the single negative remark. The brain is not being fair, it is being protective. It assumes negative information might be more important for survival, and so it magnifies it. Everyday example: online arguments. In many online debates, people from opposite sides often look at the same situation and reach completely different conclusions. Not always because one side lacks intelligence, but because each person's brain is selectively noticing evidence that fits their existing belief. Over time, confirmation bias can quietly reinforce emotional certainty, even when the full picture is more complex. Why these biases exist? At first glance, cognitive biases might seem like design flaws, but in reality, they are efficiency tools. The human brain evolved under pressure to make fast decisions with limited information. Biases helped our ancestors decide quickly, conserve mental energy, respond to potential threats rapidly. The problem is not that these shortcuts exist. The problem is that the modern world often requires slow, statistical, and highly analytical thinking, conditions very different from the environments where these biases evolved. The bigger picture: when you combine cognitive biases with the fast-reacting fear system we explored earlier, something important becomes clear. Human irrationality is rarely random. It follows patterns, predictable ones. Because the brain is not simply trying to be logical, it is trying to be fast, efficient, and above all, safe. Even when that safety comes at the cost of perfect reasoning. In the next chapter, we'll explore what happens when fear spreads between people, not just inside one brain. Because sometimes irrational behavior doesn't stay individual, it becomes contagious.
Up to this point, we've focused on what happens inside one brain. The amygdala reacts. Stress hormones rise. Logic struggles to keep up. But human behavior rarely happens in isolation. We are deeply social creatures, and when fear enters a group, something powerful and sometimes dangerous can happen. Because fear doesn't just live inside individuals, it spreads between people, often faster than logic ever could. The social brain is always watching. Human survival has always depended on groups. For most of our evolutionary history, being part of a tribe meant more protection, better access to resources, higher chances of survival. Because of this, the human brain evolved to constantly monitor what others around us are doing. Psychologists call one of the strongest of these tendencies social proof, the instinct to look to others to decide what is safe, normal, or correct. Most of the time, this shortcut is helpful. If everyone calmly walks through a doorway, you assume it's safe. If everyone suddenly runs away from something, your brain pays very close attention. And this is where group fear begins to amplify. Social proof and herd behavior under uncertainty. Humans often follow the crowd, sometimes without conscious awareness. This is known as herd behavior. It becomes especially powerful when the situation is unclear, time pressure is high, or perceived risk is rising. In these moments, the brain quietly asks, "What are other people doing?" And often, it copies the answer. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made sense. If many members of the group reacted to danger, following them quickly could increase survival odds. But in modern complex systems, especially financial markets and online spaces, herd behavior can sometimes drive large-scale irrational outcomes. Real-world example: market crashes. Financial history offers some of the clearest examples of social fear amplification. During periods of market panic, investors often begin selling rapidly. At first, the selling may be based on real concerns, but as prices fall and more people start selling, something psychological happens. Fear spreads. investors begin reacting not just to fundamentals, but to other investors' behavior. The emotional tone of the market shifts. Uncertainty rises. Urgency increases. Rational analysis weakens. What might have been a controlled correction can sometimes spiral into a sharp crash, partly driven by collective fear dynamics. Each individual may feel they are acting prudently, but together, the group can create momentum that no single person intended. Emotional contagion feelings that spread. Another powerful force in group psychology is emotional contagion. Humans are remarkably good at picking up the emotional states of people around them, often automatically. Facial expressions, tone of voice, body language, even subtle cues in text online. Your brain is constantly scanning the emotional environment. And when enough people around you appear anxious or alarmed, your own nervous system may begin to mirror that state. This happens through deep, automatic processes in the social brain. You don't consciously decide to feel tense, it just starts happening. Crowd panic when fear multiplies in high-density situations. Fear can spread with surprising speed. Imagine being in a crowded public space. Suddenly, a few people begin moving quickly in one direction. Others notice. Uncertainty rises. Within seconds, more people begin moving, often without fully understanding why. In some cases, this can escalate into full crowd panic. Importantly, most individuals in these moments are not acting irrationally on purpose. They are responding to ambiguous threat signals, visible group movement, and rising physiological arousal. The group itself becomes part of the stimulus. Online panic cycles in the digital age. Social fear spreads in new and accelerated ways. Online platforms allow emotionally charged information to travel extremely fast, when alarming headlines, rumors, or dramatic stories circulate widely. Several things can happen. Availability bias increases. Emotional language heightens arousal. Social proof signals multiply. Confirmation bias reinforces existing fears. Before long, large numbers of people may feel a shared sense of urgency, even when the underlying risk is still uncertain or evolving. This doesn't require misinformation to work. Even partial information, presented in emotionally intense ways, can trigger widespread concern. The human nervous system simply wasn't designed for global-scale emotional synchronization at digital speed. What research suggests about group fear? Research in social psychology consistently shows that groups can amplify emotional responses. Compared to individuals alone, people in groups are often more likely to take risks, react quickly, follow emerging group norms, and escalate emotional responses. This phenomenon is sometimes described as group amplification. When many nervous systems begin influencing each other in real time, the emotional signal can grow stronger than any single person intended. In calm situations, this can produce powerful cooperation, but under fear, can sometimes push groups toward rapid, collective overreaction. The key insight: human irrationality is not just a personal brain issue, it is also a social phenomenon. Your fear system evolved not only to detect physical threats, but to stay deeply attuned to the emotional signals of the people around you. Because in ancient environments, if the group sensed danger, ignoring that signal could be costly. So your brain still carries that ancient sensitivity, which means sometimes, without realizing it, you are not just reacting to the situation, you are reacting to everyone else reacting. In the next chapter, we'll shift from the science of fear to something more practical. How high performers, from athletes to emergency professionals, learn to stay logical under pressure when the fear system activates. Because while the survival brain is powerful, it is not completely uncontrollable.
Up to now, we've explored the science, the brain circuits, the stress response, the social amplification of fear. But here's the quiet truth: for most people, irrational decisions don't happen in dramatic emergencies. They happen in ordinary moments, small choices, private worries, conversations that don't go as planned, Fear rarely announces itself loudly in daily life. Instead, it often whispers, subtly shaping decisions from the background. And maybe, as we walk through these moments, some of them may feel familiar. Money decisions, playing it to save or to fast. Imagine someone watching their savings during an uncertain economic period. The numbers fluctuate, news headlines feel tense. Even if nothing immediately dangerous is happening, the body may still respond. A quiet unease appears. Maybe you've felt this too. That subtle pull to check your account again, that sudden urge to move money quickly, that uncomfortable tension when markets dip. In these moments, fear can push people into opposite directions. Some become overly cautious, avoiding reasonable opportunities because the unknown feels uncomfortable. Others react too quickly, selling, buying, or shifting resources based more on emotional urgency than careful analysis. From the outside, these decisions can look inconsistent. But from the inside, the nervous system is doing what it was designed to do: reduce uncertainty as fast as possible, even when patience might be the more logical move. Health anxiety, when the body feels too loud. Now consider something even more personal. A small physical sensation appears, maybe a brief chest flutter, a headache that lingers longer than expected, an unfamiliar ache. Logically, many of these sensations are harmless and temporary. But the human brain is highly sensitive to signals that might indicate bodily threat. And once attention locks onto the body, something interesting happens. Awareness increases, monitoring intensifies. Normal sensations begin to feel amplified. Maybe you've felt this too. Checking symptoms online late at night, noticing every small body change, feeling your heart beat more strongly simply because you're paying attention to it. This is not imagination. When the brain becomes alert to potential health threats, the fear system can heighten bodily awareness, sometimes creating a feedback loop between attention and anxiety. The more you monitor, the louder the body can seem. Relationship conflicts. When emotions speak first, fear doesn't only appear in physical or financial concerns. It also shows up in human relationships. Imagine a simple disagreement between two people. At first, the issue is small, but then tone shifts, voices tighten, and suddenly, the body begins to react. Heart rate rises, breathing changes, attention narrows. In that moment, the brain may quietly interpret the conflict not just as disagreement, but as a social threat, because for most of human history, social belonging was deeply tied to survival. Rejection could mean isolation. Isolation could mean vulnerability. So, the nervous system still treats certain interpersonal tensions as highly significant. Maybe you felt this too. Saying something sharper than you intended, interrupting when you meant to listen, feeling misunderstood and reacting quickly. Later, often when calm returns, many people reflect and think, I wish I had handled that differently. But in the moment, emotional circuitry was moving faster than reflective thinking. Career hesitation, the quiet power of uncertainty. Not all fear feels intense. Some of the most powerful forms of fear are quiet and slow-moving. Consider career decisions. Opportunities appear. A new role, a different path, a chance to step into the unknown. Logically, the opportunity might make sense, but the human brain is highly sensitive to uncertainty. And uncertainty often activates the same ancient survival circuits that once responded to physical risk. So, instead of clear reasoning, many people experience something more subtle: hesitation, overthinking, delay. Maybe you've felt this too. Reading the same job description multiple times, almost sending the application, then waiting, wanting change, but feeling pulled toward the familiar. This is one of fear's quietest influences, not panic, not obvious stress, just a gentle but persistent pull toward safety and predictability. The pattern beneath it all, across money, health, relationships, and career choices, one pattern keeps appearing. Fear rarely announces itself clearly. It often feels like caution, hesitation, urgency, or emotional tension. And because these feelings can feel reasonable in the moment, the deeper biological drivers often remain invisible. But once you understand how the brain prioritizes safety, these everyday decisions start to look different, not random, not purely logical, but shaped by an ancient nervous system still working hard to protect you. A quiet reflection. The goal here is not to eliminate fear. Fear is part of being human. It protects, it prepares, it focuses attention when real danger appears. But in the modern world, the same system can sometimes become overprotective, reacting strongly to situations that require calm analysis, whispering urgency where patience might help. And the first step toward balance is simply noticing when it happens. In the next chapter, we lines explore something hopeful, how high performers, from elite athletes to emergency professionals, train their brains to stay clear and focused even when the fear system activates. Because while fear is powerful, it is not the final authority. Up to this point, we've explored how fear can distort judgment, narrow attention, and sometimes push humans toward irrational choices. But stopping the story there would give an incomplete picture. Because fear is not simply a flaw in human design. In many situations, fear is useful. In fact, the very same system that sometimes causes overreaction is also one of the reasons humans have survived and adapted so successfully. To understand human behavior honestly, we need a balanced view, not fear as the villain, but fear as a powerful tool, one that works best within a certain range. Fear as a survival tool. At its core, fear is protective. It evolved to prepare the body and mind for potential danger. When functioning properly, fear helps you notice risks quickly, increase alertness, mobilize physical energy, focus attention on what matters most. Without fear, early humans would have been far more vulnerable to predators, environmental hazards, and social threats. Even today, a completely fear-free brain would be dangerous. Someone who feels no caution when driving, no concern near real danger, no alertness in risky environments, would face serious survival problems. So, the goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is calibration. Healthy anxiety versus toxic fear. Psychologists often distinguish between adaptive anxiety and maladaptive fear. Healthy, moderate anxiety can be useful. It sharpens attention, encourages preparation, promotes careful thinking, but when fear becomes too intense, too frequent, or too prolonged, the benefits begin to reverse. Instead of sharpening performance, excessive fear can disrupt working memory, increase impulsivity, narrow thinking too much, impair decision quality. In other words, fear follows a curve, not a straight line. And this leads us to one of the most important research findings in performance psychology, the Yerkes-Dodson law. More than a century ago, psychologists Robert Yerkes and John Dodson described a relationship between arousal, which includes stress and anxiety, and performance. Their finding is often illustrated as an inverted U-shaped curve. At very low levels of arousal, performance tends to be sluggish, attention may drift, motivation may be low, focus may feel dull. As arousal increases to a moderate level, performance often improves, alertness rises, reaction time sharpens, focus becomes more engaged. But beyond a certain point, when stress becomes too high, performance begins to decline. Memory falters, judgment narrows, mistakes increase. This is the essence of the Yerkes-Dodson law. A moderate amount of fear can help, too little, and the brain may be underengaged. Too much, and the system becomes overwhelmed. Athletes and the productive edge of fear. Elite performers understand this balance well, even if they don't always describe it in scientific terms. Before a major competition, many athletes experience noticeable nervous energy. Heart rate elevated, muscles primed, attention sharpened. But interestingly, top performers don't usually aim to eliminate this feeling completely. Instead, they learn to channel it, because within the optimal zone, that heightened arousal can improve reaction speed, increase physical readiness, enhance focus under pressure. Many athletes describe this state not as panic, but as being locked in. The body is activated, but the mind remains controlled. This is fear functioning within its useful range. Performers, speakers, and stage nerves. The same pattern appears far beyond sports. Public speakers, musicians, surgeons, and emergency professionals often report a similar experience. Before high-stakes moments, some level of nervous activation is common. In moderate amounts, it can heighten concentration, increase mental clarity, improve engagement with the task, but when the activation crosses the optimal threshold, the familiar problems return: shaky hands, mental blanks, rushed decisions. Again, the issue is rarely fear itself, it is intensity and regulation. The brain's built-in trade-off. From a neuroscience perspective, this balance reflects the ongoing interaction between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. At moderate arousal, the amygdala increases alertness, while the prefrontal cortex still maintains control. At extreme arousal, the amygdala becomes dominant, and prefrontal regulation weakens. So, the goal is not to silence the alarm system entirely. It is to keep the system within the functional zone where both speed and reasoning can work together. A more mature way to think about fear. It's tempting to divide emotions into good and bad, but the reality of human biology is more nuanced. Fear is neither purely helpful nor purely harmful. It is context-dependent. In real danger, fear can save lives. In moderate challenge, fear can boost performance. But in chronic uncertainty or overwhelming stress, fear can cloud judgment and drive impulsive behavior. Understanding this spectrum is essential for making sense of human irrationality, because many behaviors that appear irrational are not the result of too much emotion alone, but of emotion that has crossed the optimal threshold. The key insight: your brain is not trying to sabotage you. It is trying to protect and prepare you. Most of the time, fear is attempting to help, even when it overshoots. And once you recognize that, fear starts to look less like an enemy, and more like a powerful system that simply needs the right balance. In the next chapter, we lines move into something practical and empowering: how people can train their brains to stay clearer under pressure, and gently bring logic back online when fear begins to rise. Because while the survival system is ancient, it is also adaptable. By now, one thing is clear: the human brain was not built to eliminate fear. And realistically, it never will. Fear is ancient, automatic, deeply wired into survival systems. But here is the hopeful part, and this is supported by decades of neuroscience and psychology research. While fear never disappears, the brain can be trained to respond differently. Not perfectly, not instantly, but measurably and meaningfully over time. The goal is not to silence the alarm system. It is to help the thinking brain stay online while the alarm is ringing. Let's look at the science-backed methods that help make this possible. Method 1: Cognitive reappraisal. One of the most powerful tools studied in emotional regulation is called cognitive reappraisal. In simple terms, it means changing how you interpret a situation. Because the brain does not react only to events, it reacts to the meaning we assign to those events. For example, a racing heart before a presentation can be interpreted as, "I am losing control," or "My body is getting ready to perform." Same physical sensation, very different emotional outcome. Research in cognitive psychology shows that when people deliberately reinterpret stress signals in a more neutral or constructive way, activity in the prefrontal cortex increases, while amygdala reactivity can decrease. This doesn't eliminate fear, but it often reduces its intensity and improves control. Method 2: Exposure principles. Another well-supported approach comes from the science behind exposure therapy. The core idea is simple but powerful. The brain learns safety through safe experience, not just logical reassurance. When people gradually and repeatedly face situations that trigger fear, in controlled, manageable steps, something important happens. Over time, the nervous system becomes less reactive, the amygdala updates its threat predictions, the prefrontal cortex gains confidence and regulation. This process is sometimes called fear extinction learning. Importantly, exposure does not mean overwhelming yourself. In clinical settings, the most effective exposure work is gradual, repeated, and predictable. The brain learns best when it can experience the feared situation without the expected catastrophe occurring. Method 3. Stress regulation techniques. Because fear is deeply tied to the body's stress response, calming the body can help stabilize the mind. Simple physiological regulation techniques can reduce overall nervous system arousal, making it easier for the thinking brain to function. Research-supported approaches include slow, controlled breathing, brief physical movement, grounding attention in the present moment, improving sleep consistency, regular physical exercise. These methods work because they influence the autonomic nervous system, helping shift the body out of high alert mode. When the body calms, the prefrontal cortex often regains more influence. Method 4. Slowing down decisions. One of the simplest and most underused cognitive tools is deliberate pause. Remember earlier in this video, fear favors speed, logic requires time. Even a short pause can allow the initial surge of emotional reactivity to soften slightly. In high-stakes environments, many professionals are trained to build in micro-pauses before major decisions, not to overthink, but to allow the thinking brain a chance to re-engage. Sometimes the most powerful intervention is simply not reacting in the first 5 seconds. Method 5. Naming emotions. This technique sounds almost too simple, but neuroscience research has shown something fascinating. When people accurately label what they are feeling, activity in emotional centers like the amygdala can decrease, while regulatory regions in the prefrontal cortex become more active. Psychologists sometimes call this process affect labeling. For example, quietly identifying, "I notice I'm feeling anxious right now," can create a small but measurable shift in brain activity. Why? Because labeling emotions recruits language and executive networks, gently bringing the thinking brain back into the loop. It doesn't erase the feeling, but it often reduces emotional intensity enough to improve decision quality. What training really looks like. It's important to be realistic here. Training the brain is not about becoming perfectly calm in every situation. Even highly trained professionals still experience fear responses. The difference is not the absence of fear, it is the relationship with it. With practice over time, many people can develop faster emotional recovery, better pause under pressure, more flexible thinking during stress, improved awareness of fear signals. Small shifts, but meaningful ones. The key insight: the survival brain will always speak first. That part of human biology is unlikely to change, but with the right habits and awareness, the thinking brain can learn to join the conversation sooner. And in many real-world situations, that small timing difference can completely change the outcome of a decision. In the next chapter, we bring everything together, exploring what it truly means to live with a brain that is both brilliantly logical and deeply emotional. Because the goal is not to choose between fear and logic, but to understand how they were always meant to work together. There is a common myth about courage, that fearless people simply don't feel afraid. But in reality, the individuals who perform best under extreme pressure often feel fear, just as strongly as everyone else. The difference is not the absence of fear, the difference is training, preparation, and mental conditioning. Across high-stakes professions, from aviation to emergency medicine, the most reliable performers have learned a powerful truth. Fear is a signal, not a stop sign. Let's step into the real world and see how this works. Pilots, calm in the middle of chaos. Imagine sitting in the cockpit at 35,000 feet. Suddenly, an engine warning light flashes. Your heart rate spikes, adrenaline surges, your survival brain is fully awake. For an untrained person, this moment could trigger panic. But commercial pilots are trained differently. From their earliest days in flight school, pilots repeatedly practice emergency scenarios in highly realistic simulators. Engine failures, rapid decompression, severe weather, system malfunctions. They rehearse these situations so many times that when a real emergency occurs, something remarkable happens, the prefrontal cortex stays online. Instead of emotional flooding, trained pilots shift into procedural mode. Identify the problem, run the checklist, communicate with control, execute calmly. Fear response still activates. They are human, but training prevents the amygdala from fully hijacking the system. In aviation psychology, this is sometimes called stress inoculation, gradual exposure to pressure until the brain learns, I have seen this before. I know what to do. Fear becomes fuel for focus. Elite athletes, performing under extreme pressure, know shift to a different arena. A basketball player stands at the free throw line. Final seconds, championship game. Millions watching, heart pounding, hands slightly trembling. This is not weakness. This is biology. Elite athletes experience intense activation of the same fear circuits we've been discussing. The difference is how they interpret it. Sports psychologists have found that top performers often reframe pre-performance anxiety as readiness. Instead of thinking, I'm nervous, this is bad, they learn to think, my body is preparing me to perform. This cognitive reappraisal changes the entire physiological experience. Research shows that athletes who interpret arousal as helpful tend to maintain better motor control, show improved focus, recover faster from mistakes, perform more consistently under pressure over thousands of repetitions. Their brains build a powerful association. Pressure equals performance mode. Again, fear is not removed, it is redirected. Surgeons, precision in high-stress moments consider the operating room. A surgeon is performing a complex procedure. One small mistake could have serious consequences. The environment is intense but controlled. Experienced surgeons develop what psychologists sometimes call focused calm, a state where emotional noise is minimized and attention narrows in a productive way. But this ability does not appear overnight. Medical training deliberately exposes surgeons to increasing levels of responsibility and complexity. First observing, then assisting, then performing under supervision, then operating independently's gradual progression allows the brain to adapt step by step. Studies in medical performance show that experienced surgeons under pressure often demonstrate lower unnecessary movement, more stable attention, better working memory under stress, faster recovery from unexpected complications. Shire amygdala still fires, but it no longer overwhelms the thinking brain. Training builds a bridge between fear and function. First responders, thinking clearly in emergencies. No picture firefighters entering a burning building. Paramedics arriving at a chaotic accident scene. Emergency responders making split-second decisions. These environments are designed, from a biological perspective, to trigger maximum fear activation. And yet, many first responders display remarkable composure. Why? Because their training focuses heavily on automaticity under stress. They practice critical procedures repeatedly until key actions become deeply ingrained. Equipment checks, communication protocols, movement patterns, decision trees under extreme pressure. Working memory becomes limited, as we discussed earlier. But trained responders rely less on fragile working memory and more on well-learned procedural memory. In other words, they don't have to think from scratch, they execute trained patterns. This reduces cognitive overload and keeps the prefrontal cortex functioning even when adrenaline is high. The science behind fear mastery across all these professions. The pattern is clear. People who perform well under pressure typically share 3 psychological advantages. 1. Repeated exposure. Gradual, controlled exposure teaches the brain that high-stress situations are manageable. 2. Cognitive reframing. They interpret physiological arousal as readiness rather than danger. 3. Procedural training critical actions become automatic, reducing the load on working memory during stress. Together, these factors create something powerful: resilience under pressure. What this means for you don't have to be a pilot, surgeon, or elite athlete to benefit from this science. The human brain is remarkably trainable. Every time you face a stressful situation and respond deliberately instead of reactively, you are, very slowly, rewiring your threat system. You are teaching your amygdala, this feeling is uncomfortable. But it is not catastrophic. You are strengthening your prefrontal cortex. Stay online. We can handle this, and over time, something subtle but powerful begins to change. The situations that once triggered overwhelming fear start to feel manageable, then familiar, then, sometimes, surprisingly, controllable. Core takeaway: highest performers in the world are not fearless. They sweat, their hearts race, their bodies flood with adrenaline just like everyone else. But through deliberate training, they have built a different relationship with fear. They don't eliminate it. They don't suppress it. They train through it. And that ability, more than raw talent, intelligence, or confidence, is often what separates panic from performance. For most of human history, fear was not the enemy, it was protection. It was the silent alarm system that kept our ancestors alive in a world filled with real, immediate dangers. Every quick heartbeat, every surge of adrenaline, every moment of hesitation before stepping into the unknown, these reactions were shaped by millions of years of survival pressure. And in many ways, that ancient system still runs the show today. But the world has changed faster than the human brain. Today, most of us are not running from predators. We are navigating deadlines, social pressure, financial uncertainty, constant information overload. Modern stress is psychological. Ancient fear systems are biological, and that mismatch is where many of our irrational decisions begin. Understanding fear creates control. The moment you understand what fear is doing inside your brain, something powerful happens. The experience doesn't magically disappear. Your heart may still race, your thoughts may still speed up, your body may still prepare for danger, but awareness inserts a small, but critical, space between stimulus and reaction. In that space lives choice. Instead of being completely pulled by the invisible tug-of-war inside your brain, you begin to notice it happening in real time. My body is reacting. My attention is narrowing. My emotions are rising. This awareness alone can reduce the intensity of emotional hijacking, because the brain cannot easily observe and fully panic at the same time. Understanding fear doesn't make you fearless, it makes you less automatic. Awareness leads to better decisions. Every chapter of this journey has pointed to the same quiet truth. Your brain is not broken, it is doing exactly what it evolved to do. The problem is not that humans are irrational. The problem is that ancient survival wiring sometimes collides with modern complexity. When you recognize cognitive biases, when you notice emotional flooding, when you understand how stress narrows your thinking, you begin to make slightly better decisions. Not perfect decisions, better ones. And over time, small improvements in awareness compound into meaningful changes in behavior, pausing instead of reacting, checking evidence instead of assuming, breathing instead of escalating, reflecting instead of regretting. This is how decision-making improves in the real world, gradually, not instantly. The goal was never perfection. There is an important misconception we need to release. The goal is not to eliminate fear. The goal is not to become perfectly logical. And the goal is definitely not to suppress your emotions. A completely fearless human would actually be in serious danger. Fear keeps you alert. Fear keeps you cautious. Fear keeps you alive. What we are really aiming for is balance, a brain where the amygdala can warn you, the prefrontal cortex can evaluate, and neither system completely overwhelms the other. This balanced state is where the best decisions tend to emerge. Not cold logic alone, not raw emotion alone, but a conversation between the two. The human brain is still adapting. One of the most fascinating truths in neuroscience is this: human evolution has not stopped. Our brains are still adapting, culturally, behaviorally, and even biologically, to the modern environment. But evolution is slow. Technology moves fast. Information moves faster. Social pressure moves fastest of all. Which means many of us are living with Stone Age threat systems in a digital age world. That is not a design flaw. That is simply where we are in the long story of human development. And the encouraging part is this: while biological evolution takes generations, psychological adaptation can begin today. Through awareness, through training, through deliberate practice. A quiet but powerful shift. If there is one lasting takeaway from this entire journey, it is this: you don't need to fight your fear. You don't need to eliminate it. You only need to understand it well enough that it stops running your life on autopilot. Because once you can see the patterns, the surges, the biases, the emotional spikes, you begin to step slightly outside of them. And that small shift in awareness can change more decisions than most people realize. So the next time your heart races before a big decision, the next time anxiety floods your thoughts, the next time you feel that familiar internal tension, pause for just a moment. And remember, the battle between fear and logic isn't a flaw. It's the story of how humans survived. And now, with awareness, it can also be the story of how humans choose more wisely.
If this documentary helped you understand fear a little better,
To consider subscribing for more psychology-based explorations of human behavior.
You can also share your thoughts or experiences in the comments.
and sharing one's perspective may help someone else feel less alone.